So a lot of these readings right after Easter, they're from the Acts of the Apostles, and a lot of them are from the Gospel of John. We're hearing this whole kind of back and forth between the Pharisee Nicodemus, who ultimately becomes a saint, and Jesus. And it's this place where Jesus says those words, God so loved the world that he gave us his only begotten Son. So that's what he said right before this part. So it's kind of like we've just kind of jumped into a conversation. So if you ever kind of feel confused and it's like, okay, what was going on? It's just like jumping into someone's conversation and you're in the middle of it. But there's a couple things I want to maybe look at today. The first one is from the Acts of the Apostles, and I would call this the virtue of courageous honesty. So, Peter and the Apostles, when the Sanhedrin, that's kind of the high court of law of the people of Israel, and they were the ones who were jealous of Jesus. They were the ones, if you remember during the story of Holy Thursday and Good Friday, how they captured Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Judas led them to him, and then they brought them to a secret meeting of these same guys. And this is the place where the high priest tears his robe and says, what's the charge? He should be put to death. So these are the same guys that did that to Jesus, and now they've caught the apostles. Now, if you were in that situation, you know what they did to Jesus. And remember, these are the guys that were afraid when someone just came up to them and said, oh, I thought you probably were with them. Remember how Peter's like, no, I wasn't there. And that was just before one of the servants. Now he's before the big guys. This is Caiaphas. This is all these different guys that were right there, have all this authority. You'd think that he'd run away, or you'd think that he'd be like, well, kind of just change the message just a little bit to get along with you. But he doesn't do that. He says, we must obey God rather than men. And even when these leaders were infuriated, they wanted to put them to death. And we'll hear tomorrow, actually, how they get out of that situation. Where one of the very wise Pharisees, he was the one who actually taught St. Paul, we find out later. He says, guys, he's talking to the Pharisees in the Sanhedrin, he's like, remember, there was this guy who thought he was the Messiah, this guy came up and said he was the Messiah, all these different kind of false messiahs. And so they had their own little band of followers, and then that guy died, and then everyone just kind of disappeared. It's kind of like the leader of the band goes away, and then the band just kind of falls apart. And this fellow, this Pharisee, Gamaliel is his name, he says, guys, leave these guys alone, because their leader's dead, apparently. He was crucified. So if he was false, well, then their group's just going to fall apart. But he said, be careful, because you might find yourself actually fighting against God. Because if this is of God, there's nothing that you can do that can stop it. And we know the story even today, that same message, through so many different battles and dangers and difficulties and struggles and confusions, it still keeps going throughout the world. So Peter and the apostles look at these leaders and say, we always have to follow God first. And that's a great kind of thing to hold on to. If you memorize something from this passage, think we must obey God rather than men. And when we think about that, it's anything in this world. In the gospel, it talks about the one who is above everything. In other words, listen to him. The one who is of the earth is earthly and speaks of earthly things, is just at this level. But many times we put our reliance on the things of this world. And this is where different forms of peer pressure, different forms of you need to conform with what we tell you to do. You have to talk this way. You have to look this way. You have to have this kind of mind that everyone else has. And yet what the Lord is saying is, you have to have the mind of Christ. So no matter what musician, what sports player, what authority figure, what celebrity, what book, what anything, if it's something that isn't in line with what God is saying, then what St. Peter is saying here is you've got to follow God first, because this other thing is leading you to a false reality. Even if it seems so true, even if it seems like this person has it all together, if it's not where God is actually saying to go, then it's always going to be off course in some way. And you might not see it at first, but little by little, when you get lost in the woods, then you realize, oh, that wasn't all it was cut out to be. There's a very famous expression, all that glitters is not gold. So there are some things that are shiny in life, and they promise so much, but they can actually be false and hollow. There's a famous poet. You probably haven't read any of this stuff, but his name is T.S. Eliot. And believe it or not, he was one of the ones that created so much of the modern style of poetry nowadays. He was someone that did not believe in God at first, but he actually became a Christian later in life. And he talks about this poem called The Hollow Men. And he talks about how there's so much glamour on the outside, but they're kind of like a donut. There's nothing in the center. There's no heart, there's no nothing. And so much of our world is like that. There's a lot on the outside, but it's very hollow on the inside. Not unlike when we had the Superman movie filmed right down the street. There were all those buildings. I remember one of the priests that came to visit here, he was trying to pump gas at the fake gas station. And he's like, why isn't this thing working? And someone came over and was like, I'm sorry, that's fake. He's like, well, what kind of town do you guys have? Like, is that building fake? Yeah, actually that one's fake too. You remember where all those buildings were there? And it was just like one-dimensional. So it looked so real. But then when you just walked around it, there's nothing. There's no other walls. And so it takes this virtue of trusting God. Because many times we see the thing that's flashy, we see sort of that front side, and it draws us in and says, this must be the right thing. And yet there's this quiet, still voice that says, keep looking around the sides. And we might say, no, I see it right here. This is where it's at. And we keep hearing that little still voice that's so quiet, and we can brush it away, but it doesn't leave us alone. And it says, look on the sides. Look behind the thing that's so shiny. Follow me first, rather than men. That's the first thing to think about. And I would just encourage you to maybe examine what are the things that you find draw you in. And are they in line with what God is calling you to? Because when they are, then those things actually come alive. It's like when we don't follow God first and we follow after the shiny thing, it is the one wall attraction that's hollow. But when we follow God and He leads us to that thing, we realize that it fills out in a mysterious way. And we start realizing that the things of this world, when we go through God first, He actually makes them three-dimensional. He opens them up. He gives them life. If we go to them first, we find one dimension. If we go to them through Christ, they open up and become beautiful. So go to Christ first. Obey God rather than men, and the things of this world will start popping out and becoming more alive. The second thing to think about here is this word, it's in the gospel. and it talks about the wrath of God. You've probably heard that before, the wrath of God. And maybe sometimes you might think of God almost as like these two people. And even there were people way back, even during the time of, like, a little after the apostles, that were saying there must be two different gods. Because you have sort of like, sometimes they think of it as like happy Jesus. He's kind of like, love one another, I'm the gentle shepherd. And then you have like the God that's pouring out fire. And you're like, is this the same God? Or what's going on here? Is it like mean dad and really nice son? Or what's going on? So it's always important to remember that this is always the same God. God never changes. He doesn't have bad days. And sometimes maybe we encounter people that love us, but maybe they have a bad day, and they're kind of kind this time, and then they kind of get really mad. And sometimes we take that and we put that on God. And we sort of think of God as kind of, he's really, really kind, but then if we kind of get on his bad side, he kind of turns and that sometimes keeps us away from him. And it's kind of like, well, I can't really trust you. But when we hear this word wrath of God, the way to think of it is like this. God's love never changes. It always is poured out. It's like his heart is always open towards us. But that love, it pushes away the darkness. It pushes away the weeds. It pushes away the things that are rejecting him. And he says to us, don't hold on to those things. Because as his love is trying to push those things out of your life so that you can experience happiness, you can experience joy, we could hold on to that thing. And just like if you think of this water being poured out, this rushing love that's trying to get rid of all of those things that hurt us, that pull us down, we could say, no, I really want to hold on to this log. But if we hold on to the log in a river, what's going to happen? Sooner or later, it's going to go off a waterfall. And the love of God is pouring out, but we're saying, no, I really need this. I really need this. I want my way. And the Lord is saying, please just let go of that thing because it's hurting you. Come back to my love. And we have the ability to say, I choose this. And the Lord loves us so much that he says, if this is what you think will really make you happy, it hurts me that you're leaving me because of this, but you can have your will instead of my will if you want. But ultimately, that leads to going off of the waterfall with the log. But do you see how that's not God being mean or changing? It's always his love. But are we accepting it? Or are we holding on to something else? And that's where his love, in the way that we experience it, becomes the wrath of God. Because it's the consequences of holding on to something that's burning us. It's holding on to the burning log, saying, no, this is what's going to make me happy. And the Lord is like, look, you're holding on to a burning log. It's hurting you. Let it go. So that's how we're supposed to understand the wrath of God. It's not God having a nice day and bad day. God always has the loving day. But it really reminds us, are we holding on to something and making that our God? Because sooner or later, it will lead us off the waterfall. So that's a way, whenever you encounter that word, and maybe you're tempted to think of God as sort of these two different faces, God never changes. He loves. But it depends on what we do with that love. Do we hold on to something else? Or do we let go and say, Lord, fill me with your love?